A scream split the quiet Chicago morning. "Step back, ma'am. This is a restricted area." Then came the sound of heavy boots on stone steps, a brief struggle and a heavy silence. Two police officers in blue uniforms dragged a black woman down the front stairs of City Hall. She wore a cream-colored suit, clutching a dark leather briefcase. Her figure was small, yet her posture stayed straight, even as they pulled her away. Bystanders stopped, phones lifted, cameras capturing the moment a woman was treated like a criminal on the very steps of the place she once called the House of Justice. "Elena Brooks," she said quietly, her voice calm. "I work here." "No, you don't," replied Officer Blake, tall and broad, his hand gripping her arm tightly. "You don't look like anyone authorized to walk into this building," his partner Turner chuckled. "Maybe she's here to apply for welfare." The laughter echoed coldly across the stone steps. Elena didn't react. She lifted her gaze toward the dome of the building, reflecting sunlight as if in defiance. Inside, a few employees had stopped to watch. A blonde woman trembled as she filmed the scene. Papers fell from Elena's briefcase, some bearing the City Legal Affairs logo, fluttering across the pavement. Blake bent down to pick one up, glanced at it, then scoffed. "Fake. You think a few sheets of paper will make me believe you?" Elena took a steady breath. "I have a meeting this morning. I arrived on time, like every day." Blake smirked. "On time to cause trouble." He motioned to Turner. "Get her out of here, away from the front entrance." The two men pulled her across the plaza. The wind picked up, blowing her hair across her face. An elderly man stopped his bicycle and murmured, "I know her, she works for the government," but no one dared to intervene. Blake's expression stayed cold, his eyes hard as stone. Inside Elena's mind, everything spun, yet her face remained composed. 15 years in law had taught her how to confront injustice, not with anger, but with reason. She had defended many who'd been mistreated because of their skin color, but today she was living proof of it herself. As they pushed her toward the patrol car, Elena turned her head back toward the building, the 12th floor right-hand window that was her office. Inside, the police reform case file still sat on her desk beside the coffee she had poured at 6 that morning. A small detail, but one that made her eyes sting. Blake opened the car door, his tone sharp. "You want to cooperate, or should I make you?" Elena gave a faint smile. "You can try." The smile made Blake pause. It wasn't the smile of fear, but of someone who knew she held a power he couldn't comprehend. He shoved her into the back seat and slammed the door. Outside, sudden rain began to fall. Droplets clung to the window, blurring the image of the building. Amid sirens and traffic noise, Elena closed her eyes. She knew one phone call could make the entire department bow in apology. But she didn't call. Not today. She wanted them to reveal their true faces before the world saw who they really were. Up front, Blake muttered, "Every day someone thinks they're special. She should be grateful we didn't cuff her." "Maybe she'll sue," Turner said. Blake smirked. "Sue who?" "We followed procedure." Elena opened her eyes, gazing through the rain-streaked glass, whispering softly, "Justice doesn't live on a badge. It lives in how we treat people." Her words vanished beneath the sound of rain, but her eyes glowed with quiet resolve, the look of someone who knew truth would eventually speak. The car turned off the Boulevard City Hall, growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Yet somewhere in the heart of the city, a fire had been lit, the spark of a story about prejudiced justice and an identity two officers would soon regret ever touching. The courtroom inside City Hall was packed that day, thick with a mix of curiosity and outrage. The incident of two police officers dragging a black woman down the steps of City Hall had flooded social media overnight. Photos, videos, and furious comments dominated every news feed. Now, the Chicago Police Department was forced to hold an internal hearing, and the first person summoned was Officer Blake. Blake entered wearing a neatly pressed uniform and a perfectly tied tie, his expression carrying a false air of solemnity. He walked down the hallway as if attending an award ceremony, not a disciplinary hearing. The white neon lights reflected off the silver badge on his chest, making it gleam a symbol of power he believed was untouchable. His lawyer, a gray-haired man named Douglas Crane, adjusted his collar and stepped up to speak. Members of the board, my client acted according to proper security procedures. He did not engage in any form of discrimination. He simply performed his duty as required. Blake nodded, glancing toward the public gallery where Eleanor Brooks sat quietly dressed in a white blouse and gray blazer. Her gaze held no anger, only cold detachment, as if she were watching a clumsy play. Douglas continued. That morning, Officer Blake observed a woman without valid identification entering the entrance reserved for officials. She behaved suspiciously evasive and refused to comply when asked to leave. Officer Blake, with 15 years of experience, acted to ensure the safety of the building. "Thank you, Counselor," said the chair. "Officer Blake, please describe the events in your own words." Blake stood, his voice confident. "Around 6:40 that morning, I saw her heading toward the VIP entrance. She looked unusual. Her appearance didn't fit that of someone working in government, I've seen enough to know. When I asked for identification, she stayed silent. When I told her to leave, she argued. So I had to act." A murmur rippled through the room. A reporter scribbled furiously while cameras turned toward Eleanor. Her expression remained unchanged, her eyes half closed, as if listening to an old melody she already knew by heart. Douglas smiled and asked, "Do you believe your actions were justified?" "Absolutely. I don't see skin color, I see behavior." And hers was suspicious. In that moment, the room went still. Those familiar, hollow, self-assured words echoed like an invisible confession. The presiding officer leaned toward the microphone. "You said you don't see skin color, but did you verify why she was at City Hall?" Blake hesitated before replying, "No, sir. But if I stopped to check every person, security would fall apart." The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, rose to speak. Young, sharp. Her voice cut through the air like glass. "Officer Blake, you said she failed to present ID. Did you ask if she had one?" Blake faltered. "No. But people who work legitimately usually wear their badges around their necks." Rachel smiled coldly. "So you concluded someone was illegitimate simply because she wasn't wearing a badge?" Blake's face flushed. Douglas tried to intervene, but Rachel raised a hand to stop him. "You said you don't see color. Then why was she the only one stopped, while 3 white employees entered at the same time without question?" The air thickened. Cameras turned slowly toward Blake. He swallowed, hard eyes darting for escape. I didn't notice them. I only saw her behaving suspiciously." Rachel lowered her voice, each word sharp and deliberate. Suspicious behavior, or simply someone who looked different? Silence fell heavy across the room. In the public gallery, Elena lifted her head. In her eyes glimmered a light, not of anger, but of someone watching a wall begin to crack. Douglas quickly objected, but the chair dismissed it. Rachel stepped closer to Blake, her tone cutting through the quiet. "Do you even know who she is?" Blake raised an eyebrow and sneered. A woman who refused to follow orders. A troublemaker. Rachel turned to the board. Thank you. That answer is exactly why we're here today. Outside, rain began to fall harder, tapping against the courtroom windows, like the sound of justice demanding to be heard. Elena exhaled softly, her hands clasped tightly. She didn't need to speak. She knew the truth always finds its way, and soon the world would realize who truly deserves to sit in the seat of judgment. The rain still fell lightly outside, as Rachel Kim stood a thick file in her hand and a sharp glint in her eyes. Members of the board, she said, I'd like to begin cross-examination. The entire room fell silent. A bright light shone over the witness stand, where Officer Blake sat trying to maintain his composure, though beads of sweat were already forming on his forehead. Officer Blake Rachel began slowly. You mentioned that you acted according to protocol. Can you list exactly what those procedures are when someone is suspected of not having proper clearance to enter the building? Blake swallowed hard. First visual verification, then a request for identification. And did you follow both of those steps I verified visually? She wasn't wearing a badge. Didn't respond quickly, so Rachel cut him off. So you never actually asked for identification, did you? A murmur spread through the room. Blake stammered. I didn't need to when the signs were clear. Rachel leaned forward, her voice like a blade. Clear or biased, Douglas Crane shot to his feet. Objection. That question is insulting. The chair raised a hand calmly. Overruled. Proceed. Rachel's eyes never left Blake. Do you remember what you said to the woman that morning I just told her to leave the area? Do you recall using the words ghetto and trash? Blake froze. I don't remember. Rachel pressed a button on a small recorder and his own voice filled the room, coarse and dripping with contempt. Get your ghetto ass out of here. The courtroom erupted in shock. The chair struck the gavel 3 times, calling for order. Blake looked down. Douglas's forehead gleamed with sweat. Rachel closed the device and said coolly, Is that what you call procedure? In the public gallery, Elena sat motionless. The lights reflected off her dark brown eyes, giving them a metallic gleam. There was no anger left in her expression, only a deep sadness, the kind born from understanding exactly how the system truly worked. Rachel continued. Officer Blake, you claim you are not racist. Do you know how many black individuals you stopped at the entrance this past year? Blake stayed silent. I'll answer for you. 12. Not a single white person was treated the same way. The air thickened again. Cameras panned slowly across the room and settled on Elena's face. A reporter whispered, She's so calm, like she's seen this all before. Rachel stepped closer to the witness stand. Her gaze locked on Blake. Have you ever considered that you might be wrong? That the woman you stopped didn't just belong there, but had the authority to give you orders? Blake frowned. Part anger, part confusion. She was just some government worker. Rachel didn't respond. She only smiled faintly. We'll find out soon enough. The hearing recessed. Blake stepped down and Douglas pulled him aside, his voice low but tense. Listen to me, Marcus. If she really works for the government, we need to settle this now. Blake lowered his voice. She's nobody. I know her type. They always think they're special. Elena walked past, hearing every word, but never slowing her pace. She spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear. Sometimes the people you think aren't special are the ones who define what justice really means. Blake turned sharply, but she was already walking away, her posture straight, her steps steady. Outside, the rain kept falling, each drop echoing like the heartbeat of a city, waiting for something to erupt, something that would soon force every shining badge to bow before the truth. That afternoon, the hearing resumed in heavy silence. The press filled every hallway, cameras focused on the woman who had stirred an entire city, Elena Brooks. She stepped onto the witness stand in a charcoal gray suit with a white collar, her hair neatly tied back. As she raised her hand to take the oath, the light reflected off her face, making it shine. Every eye in the room turned toward the woman who had once been dragged across the steps of City Hall. Please describe what happened that morning, the chair said. Elena's voice was calm. I arrived at City Hall around 6:40 as usual. When I walked through the main gate, Officer Blake stopped me. I told him I worked there and needed to come in early to prepare documents. He didn't listen. He only said I didn't look like someone who belonged there. Then he dragged me away while the crowd filmed everything. She paused to take a quiet breath. He insulted me, called me ghetto trash. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. To him, my skin color was already a sentence. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Prosecutor Rachel Kim stepped forward. Ms. Brooks, did you resist? No. I knew if I fought back, he would say I was being threatening. I chose silence. Justice requires reason, not shouting. Rachel nodded. You said you work in the legal field? Elena answered softly but firmly. Yes, I oversee procedures that protect civil rights. Attorney Douglas rose with a mocking smile. How interesting. If you understand the law, why didn't you show your ID? Elena met his gaze, her tone steady. Because I wasn't asked. Officer Blake judged me guilty before asking for proof. The room fell completely silent. Douglas tried to recover. Perhaps you acted suspiciously. You were alone arriving early, Elena replied clearly. If arriving early and working hard are suspicious acts, then this system of justice has a problem. Blake sat below his eyes, darkening each word from her mouth, tightening around him like a vice. Rachel took a step forward. After the incident, did you receive an apology? No. They only sent me a document asking whether I had caused a disturbance. Rachel turned toward the board. A woman is dragged from her workplace, and the only question they ask is whether she caused trouble. Is that what we now call justice? The gavel struck demanding order, but the room had already shifted. No one looked at Elena as a helpless victim anymore. Elena sat down, her eyes drifting toward the rain-streaked window. She remembered the years spent drafting police reform reports, the endless nights she believed might someday change the system. Now, she was living proof that it hadn't. Blake lowered his head. The memory replayed in his mind, her calm face, her faint smile, those fearless eyes. He had thought it was defiance, but now he understood it was the confidence of someone who knew the truth was on her side. When the chair announced a recess, Elena stepped down from the stand. Her posture was straight, her steps slow and steady. Each one seemed to declare that this hearing was only the beginning, and when it ended, the world would finally learn who she truly was. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air in the city was still heavy. City Hall was surrounded by reporters, tangled signs, and crowds waiting for answers. On the 6th floor, inside a small office stacked with files, Prosecutor Rachel Kim leaned over her computer screen, dark circles under her eyes after a sleepless night. On her desk sat a thick pile of documents, each stamped with the same title, Disciplinary Record, Officer M. Blake. The door opened. Her assistant Malak entered, holding a USB drive. "We got the security footage," he said quietly. "Not just from that morning. There's more." Rachel looked up, her gaze sharpening. "How much more?" "Over 10 incidents in 6 months, all with the same behavior. Every person he stopped was a person of color." Rachel took the USB and plugged it in. The screen flickered to life, showing Blake stopping a middle-aged black man outside the courthouse, demanding to check his bag, then a Latina woman questioned for using the wrong entrance. None of them had caused any trouble, yet all were detained while their white companions passed without issue. Rachel clenched her jaw, her hand tightening around the mouse. "He thinks that badge gives him the right to judge." Malik glanced at her. "We have enough to charge him under civil rights violations." Rachel nodded, her tone low but steady. "Not yet. I need to prove this isn't just one man's fault, it's the system." She opened another folder, 7 citizen complaints, all dismissed. Each bore the same signature, Captain R. Morrison. A cold smile touched her lips. A network of protection. They think they can hide forever. Across the city, in a 14th floor apartment, Elena Brooks sat at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop lighting her calm face. She scrolled through news articles about herself. The headlines called her a victim of prejudice, the woman who stayed silent in the face of injustice. Elena shook her head gently. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted the truth. The phone rang. It was Rachel. "I have the evidence. He's been accused of discrimination 7 times, and his superior covered every one of them." Elena's voice was even. "I assume you've seen the videos too." "I have," Rachel said. "And there's more. He once joked about keeping the building's standards. You know what that means?" Elena was silent for a moment, then replied, "Do your part for justice. I'll handle the rest." After the call, she opened a drawer and took out a sealed folder labeled Security Reform Proposal, Confidential. She had written those guidelines herself 3 years earlier, a proposal requiring all officers to receive training on equality and civil rights. It had never been implemented, indefinitely delayed pending approval. The one responsible for that approval was Captain Morrison Blake's direct superior. Elena looked at the document, a faint smile curving her lips. "Perfect timing," she murmured. That afternoon at the hearing, Rachel submitted the new evidence. The large screen lit up, displaying a series of surveillance clips. Blake's arrogance, his demeaning tone, his hostile actions. The courtroom fell silent. Blake sat frozen, his face pale. Morrison, his supervisor, blanched as his signature appeared on the screen. Rachel ended her presentation with a voice as sharp as a blade. "This is no longer about one man's misconduct. This is systemic protection, a structure of power built to conceal prejudice." Elena sat still, her hands clasped together. In her eyes there was no anger left, only resolve. She knew that after today, the wall they had built for years would begin to crack. And when it finally collapsed, everyone would see that sometimes justice doesn't come from those who wear the badge, but from the very person they tried to step on. On Tuesday morning, the courtroom was packed. The air felt compressed, every gaze fixed on the large screen at the front. On it, the slow-motion footage played Officer Blake stopping a black man at the courthouse entrance, demanding to check his bag because he looked suspicious. In the next clip, he smiled and chatted with a white woman walking beside the man, opening the gate for her without a single question. with each video that played the room erupted in murmurs. Rachel Kim stood at the podium, her voice steady, but every word sharp as a blade. 17 videos, 6 months, 12 victims, all of them people of color. This is not a mistake. This is a pattern. Blake's lawyer, Douglas Crane, sprang to his feet. These clips don't tell the full story. My client was simply following protocol. Rachel turned, her eyes blazing. Protocol. What kind of protocol allows an officer to insult citizens and choose who to search based on the color of their skin? The room fell silent. Blake sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly until his knuckles turned white. On the witness bench, Captain Morrison, the man who had signed off on his reports, pressed his lips together, his eyes unsteady. Rachel stepped slowly to the center of the room. We are not just examining the actions of one officer. We are examining a system that has enabled discrimination for years. She lifted a thick stack of papers. 7 complaints, all dismissed, all bearing the same approving signature, Captain R. Morrison. The sound of whispers rippled like a wave. Morrison shot to his feet. I did my duty. There was no concrete evidence. Rachel cut him off. No evidence, or did you simply choose not to see it? She raised a recording device. The speakers filled with Morrison's voice from an internal meeting, dry and casual. Blake's doing good work. He knows how to keep standards around here. The room froze. Morrison's face drained of color as he took a step back. The gavel struck, calling for order, but the weight of those words hung in the air like an invisible verdict. In the back row, Elena Brooks watched in silence, her expression calm, but unreadable. She had suspected this all along, but hearing it aloud still made her chest tighten. Years of working inside that very institution had shown her countless excuses just like these, but never had anyone dared to expose them publicly. Rachel turned to the board. When the standards of an institution mean excluding others because of their race, that is no longer a standard, it is a sin. Blake lifted his head, confusion clouding his eyes. For a brief moment, his gaze met Elena's. She said nothing, but in her eyes was a silent judgment, deeper than any sentence. Douglas tried to salvage what he could. Officer Blake has served 15 years with distinction. He never intended to discriminate. Rachel replied coldly, "Good records don't absolve prejudice, and intent doesn't erase harm." The chair announced a 10-minute recess. People rose from their seats, the courtroom breaking into tense clusters of conversation. Reporters swarmed, scribbling notes, cameras flashing everywhere. Elena remained seated, her eyes fixed on the plaque behind the judge's bench that read, "In justice we trust." She shook her head slightly as if that phrase had become nothing more than a forgotten promise. Rachel approached her and spoke softly. "We're winning, but I need you ready. It's almost time for you to reveal the rest." Elena looked up, her voice calm and resolute. "They think this is just a case about discrimination. But when the truth comes out, they'll understand it's a lesson about power." Outside, the morning wind swept through the square, scattering newspapers across the pavement, each one bearing the same headline, "Officers' Bias Exposed. Justice on Trial." Elena rose her coat, shifting gently as she moved. The fatigue of a victim was gone from her face, replaced by the quiet certainty of someone who knew she was about to hold the scales of justice in her own hands. Tomorrow she would stand before the entire court. And when she did, it wouldn't just be Blake, but the entire system that had protected him that would bow before the woman they once dismissed. The night before the final hearing, the city of Chicago glowed as if awaiting a verdict greater than any single trial. In her 14th floor apartment, Elena Brooks sat alone by the window, a cup of cold tea in her hand. The soft golden light illuminated her face, making her look both weary and resolute. Outside, the traffic moved endlessly, but her mind wandered back to the past, to the moment when it all began. 5 years earlier, Elena had served as a legal advisor for the Committee on Social Equity. She had drafted a comprehensive security reform policy that required regular training on civil rights and racial equality for all city police officers. But the proposal was shelved under the excuse of budget limitations. The person who signed the delay order was none other than Captain Morrison. Elena remembered that meeting clearly, how he had looked at her and said mockingly, "You're trying to teach the police how to be human. We have experience. We don't need moral lectures." She had remained silent then, but that silence had become a scar that never healed. The doorbell rang. Rachel Kim entered, her coat damp with rain, a new folder in her hand. "Elena, I just received confirmation," she said, her voice tired yet charged with energy. "Morrison was investigated 3 times for bias in recruitment. Every record was erased from the system." She placed the papers on the table. "Tomorrow, when I present this, he'll have nowhere left to hide." Elena nodded slowly. "We're not just exposing one man. We're confronting the way they define the word procedure. I want everyone to see that this system is what creates men like Blake." Rachel studied her for a moment before asking quietly, "Are you ready to reveal who you really are? Once you do this, case will change completely." Elena fell silent, her eyes drifting toward a photo on the bookshelf, her husband and her son. Her husband, a human rights attorney, had died 3 years earlier during a wrongful arrest. That day, she had sworn never to let justice remain a privilege of the powerful. "It's time," she said softly. "I have no reason to stay silent anymore." After Rachel left, Elena sat alone in the quiet room. She opened her laptop and began typing into a document titled Statement for Courtroom, Confidential. Each word she wrote was both a wound and a declaration of war. When she finished, she closed the computer and gazed out at the city lights, her eyes glinting like steel. The next morning, the courthouse was busier than ever. Television crews set up outside, broadcasting live coverage of what the news called the trial redefining justice. Inside, Blake sat motionless, his face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. Morrison stood beside his lawyer, trying to maintain composure, though his hands trembled slightly. Elena entered the room. No one spoke, but the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She wore a black suit with a silver pin on her lapel, a small detail few noticed. It was the commemorative badge she had received the day she was appointed as a federal judge. Only Rachel recognized it. She gave a faint nod, understanding that the moment they had waited for had arrived. In the stillness before the presiding judge entered, Elena looked around the room. Every face from officers and lawyers to the citizens seated in the back reflected a piece of the society she hoped to change. She exhaled softly, feeling an unexpected peace wash over her. The doors opened, and the presiding judge walked in. Elena tightened her grip on the stack of papers in her hands. Today, the truth would no longer hide behind the word procedure. Today, those who had once dismissed her would learn the true meaning of one word: justice. On Wednesday morning, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of the courtroom, casting pale light onto the cold marble floor. The hearing began under a strange atmosphere, silent yet tense, like still water before a storm. The public gallery was full, reporters lined up with cameras aimed at the witness stand. In the front row, Elena Brooks sat upright, holding the stack of papers she had written through the night. The presiding judge spoke. "We will now continue the hearing regarding the incident at City Hall. Prosecutor Rachel Kim, do you have an additional witness?" Rachel stepped forward, her voice clear and firm. "Yes, Your Honor. The next witness is the woman seen in the video, Ms. Elena Brooks." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Every camera turned toward Elena. She rose, walking slowly but steadily, her gaze calm, not fearful as though she had stood in this place many times before. Rachel began. "Ms. Brooks, could you tell the court the real reason you were at City Hall that morning?" Elena looked around the room, her voice soft but resonant. "I was there to work. I was not a visitor nor a stranger. I was there to fulfill my responsibilities within the public system." Defense attorney Douglas Crane interrupted with a mocking tone. "And what exactly is your job, Ms.?" "Brooks Security Secretary, Administrative Staff." A faint smile touched Elena's lips. "No. My job is to oversee people like you and people like Officer Blake to ensure they understand the true meaning of the word justice." The courtroom fell completely silent. Rachel stepped forward slowly and asked the final question. "Ms. Brooks, can you tell the court your official position?" Elena paused for a brief moment, then spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "I am Federal Judge Elena Brooks, appointed 3 weeks before the incident. That morning, I was arriving to preside over a meeting on security reform. The room exploded in shock like thunder. People in the back row gasped. Reporters froze mid-motion, cameras forgotten in their hands. Douglas stood speechless, and Blake turned pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly. "Order, maintain order." But the noise swelled like a wave. Elena stood motionless at the center of the storm, her composure commanding the entire courtroom into silence. Rachel turned toward the panel, her tone low but resolute. "Members of the court, the woman my opposing counsel's client dragged down the courthouse steps and publicly insulted in broad daylight was not an ordinary citizen. She was a representative of federal law." Elena looked directly at Blake, his face drained of color, panic flickering in his eyes. I didn't know," he stammered. Elena replied softly, her voice like a quiet wind that somehow filled the room. "You didn't know, because you never asked. You only saw the color of my skin and decided I didn't belong." Blake lowered his head, gripping the edge of the table, his hands trembling. All his excuses, all those years of self-righteous certainty, shattered like glass. Douglas tried to recover. "Your Honor, regardless of her identity, my client acted without malicious intent." Rachel cut him off. "Without malice. He dragged a federal judge from her own workplace, hurled racial insults at her, and called it procedure. That's not a mistake, that's an attitude." The gavel struck again. In the gallery, everyone sat in silence, staring at Elena, the woman who had once been humiliated, now standing tall at the center of the courtroom, forcing an entire system of power to bow. In that moment, the morning light slanted through the window, casting a faint glow across her shoulders. No one spoke, but everyone understood the scales of justice had shifted, and they were now tipping toward the woman they had once looked down upon. The courtroom was wrapped in heavy silence. Every eye was fixed on Elena Brooks, The woman who only minutes ago had been seen as a victim now stood tall as a living symbol of justice. No one dared whisper, no keyboards clicked, no pens scratched across paper. Even the cameras seemed to pause, as if the lenses themselves needed a moment to grasp the weight of the figure before them. Elena looked directly at the defendant's table. "Officer Blake." She said, her voice calm but chilling. "You dragged me from my own workplace. You caused the security reform meeting I was supposed to lead to be postponed. Do you have any idea how many people were affected by your actions?" Blake opened his mouth, but only a strained breath escaped. His lawyer, Douglas Crane, tugged at his sleeve, murmuring, "Stay quiet." But Elena continued waiting for no reply. "You've taken pride in your 15 years of maintaining order. But in those 15 years, what have you truly learned other than to judge people by the color of their skin? Justice doesn't live in a uniform or a gun. It lives in how we see others with respect." Captain Morrison Blake's direct supervisor lowered his head to avoid her gaze. Rachel Kim stood silently nearby, her hands clenched tightly. She knew that from the moment Elena had stepped forward and revealed who she was, this case had ceased to be just a legal battle. It had become an indictment of the entire system. Douglas rose, his voice hoarse. "Your Honor, my client didn't know that Ms. Brooks was a judge. He was merely following security protocol." Elena turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. "I don't need him to know who I am to be treated with respect. Every citizen deserves to be treated with dignity." The words rippled through the corridor. "That's Mike. Current." A young reporter in the back row lowered his camera, his eyes glistening. Rachel stepped forward to speak. "Your Honor, the evidence shows this was not a one-time mistake. This was a behavioral pattern, a habit of disregarding others because they don't look right. And today that behavior resulted in a federal judge being dragged out of her own workplace. If this can happen to someone like Ms. Brooks, imagine what has happened to those without the power to defend themselves." Blake bowed his head, his shoulders trembling. For the first time, he felt the true weight of the word justice, a word he had written in his reports for years without understanding its meaning. Elena looked at him, her tone softer now, almost compassionate. "You thought I was a stranger, but I was the one who signed off on the security policies you follow. I once believed the law could teach people fairness. But you have shown me that when hearts refuse to change, the law is nothing more than paper." The presiding judge struck the gavel, his deep voice filling the chamber. "We've heard enough. The court will recess for 15 minutes before sentencing." As Elena stepped down from the stand, she paused beside the prosecution table. Rachel whispered, "You just did what this entire system never had the courage to do. Let the truth speak through your very presence." Elena replied softly, "I didn't do it for myself. I did it so that one day when another black woman walks into this building, she won't be asked, 'Who are you?' but 'How can I help you?'" Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very steps of the courthouse. The doors opened and the afternoon sunlight poured in like a declaration of truth. Sometimes justice doesn't need to be granted. It only needs one brave soul to stand up and remind the world that it still exists. That afternoon, when the counsel returned, the courtroom had transformed into a stage for truth. There were no more whispers, no skeptical glances. Everyone understood now this was no longer a trial about one police officer, but a reckoning for a prejudice that had existed far too long. Prosecutor Rachel Kim stepped to the podium, her voice steady, every word carving through the air. Members of the court, over the past days, we have seen one undeniable truth. This system was not broken by mistakes, but by the habit of disregarding human dignity. Officer Blake did not merely insult a citizen. He humiliated the very concept of justice he swore to uphold. She raised a still image from the video, Blake dragging Elena down the courthouse steps, his eyes filled with contempt. This is not the image of law enforcement. This is the symbol of power abused. Blake's lawyer, Douglas Crane, rose with a weary tone. Your Honor, my client admits his mistake, but he acted without malice. He was simply fulfilling his duty. Rachel countered immediately. Duty is not an excuse to trample dignity. No one entrusted with enforcing the law has the right to stand above it. Blake sat hunched forward, staring at the statement before him, hastily written in uneven handwriting. At the bottom, a single line read, "I didn't know, I just acted on instinct." The judge looked at him. Officer Blake, do you have anything to say before sentencing? The room grew heavy with silence. Blake drew a trembling breath. I was wrong. I thought I was doing the right thing. But today, I understand I've been seeing the wrong things for 15 years. I'm sorry. His voice cracked and faded into the quiet. Elena looked at him, her expression no longer angry, only quietly exhausted. I accept your apology, she said, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Justice is not about emotion, it's about responsibility. The judge nodded, his voice slow and deliberate. The counsel has reviewed all evidence and testimony. Officer Blake is found guilty of abuse of power and violation of civil rights. He is hereby stripped of his badge and sentenced to 18 months in prison with 2 years of supervision. A wave of sound rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled to record every word, while Blake sat motionless, his eyes hollow. Morrison bowed his head, knowing his career was over. As the final strike of the gavel echoed, Elena closed her eyes. In that moment, memories flooded back the morning she had been dragged through the rain, the mocking stares, the cold voice of a man who believed justice was his to command. Now those sounds faded, leaving only the quiet sigh of release. Rachel approached and whispered, You did what no one else could. This case will change the system. Elena smiled faintly. No, Rachel. I only opened a door. Others will have to walk through it to keep it open. She stepped away from the witness stand, walking slowly down the aisle between the rows of seats. Those who once saw her as a victim now rose silently, watching her pass. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, falling gently across her face, soft, yet powerful. The courthouse doors opened. Elena looked up at the clear Chicago sky after the storm. She knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new era, one where justice would no longer be protected by badges, but by the courage of those who stand tall when the world tries to keep them down. 6 months after the trial, Chicago had changed. The rows of flags outside City Hall fluttered in the wind, no longer cold and distant, but gleaming brightly, a reminder of justice reborn. Above the steps where Eleanor Brooks had once been, dragged a new bronze plaque had been mounted, engraved with the words, "Respect is the foundation of justice." That morning, the city hosted the inauguration of the Civil Security Reform Program, the Brooks Protocol, a new system based on the standards Elena had written years ago, now officially approved and implemented statewide. Hundreds of citizens, officials, officers, and journalists filled the square. Rachel Kim took the stage, her voice steady and amplified through the speakers. "We are not here to celebrate a victory," she said, "but to make a promise that justice will never again be taken for granted." In the front row sat Elena, wearing a beige coat, the sunlight glinting off her dark hair and calm, steady eyes. Beside her was Malik, formerly Rachel's assistant, now coordinator of the city's anti-bias police training program. "It all started on a rainy day," he murmured. "No one thought a single act of wrongdoing would spark this kind of change." Elena smiled softly. "The price of change is always pain, but if no one stands up, that pain means nothing." When Rachel finished her speech, she invited Elena to the stage. The applause thundered through the square like rolling waves. Elena walked forward slowly, each step grounded no longer the woman humiliated at City Hall, but the one who had forced an entire system to face itself. Standing before the microphone, her voice was gentle, yet carried across the plaza. "I am not a hero," she said. "I am simply someone who believes that dignity is not something to be given, it is something to be recognized. And today I don't want to speak about the mistakes of a few individuals, but about our shared belief that we can be better." She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "Justice is not the sound of a gavel in a courtroom, it's how we treat one another when no one is watching. When an officer smiles at someone he once feared, when a child of color can walk through the courthouse doors without bowing her head, that is justice." The audience fell silent, then erupted into sustained applause. Many young officers stood placing hands over their hearts. An older officer approached and said quietly, "Judge Brooks, I once served under Captain Morrison. Thank you for making us look at ourselves." Elena nodded, saying nothing, only squeezing his hand gently, a silent gesture of forgiveness. After the ceremony, she returned to her old office on the 12th floor, the place where that fateful morning had begun. The room had been renovated, new floors, new desk, but the window still overlooked the square. She stood there watching young recruits gathered for the first training session of the new program. On the screen in front of them, bright letters read, "Equality begins with awareness." Rachel entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said, "the media is calling you the voice of justice. They say your case is now being taught in law schools." Elena smiled faintly. "I don't need titles. I just want people, when they see someone different, to stop feeling fear and start feeling curiosity." She sat down and opened a new file. Her next project was titled Community Trust Initiative, a program designed to build bridges between citizens and police. Rachel glanced at it and raised an eyebrow. "You're not planning to take a break, are you?" "No," Elena replied. "Justice doesn't take days off." A while later, she stepped outside, walking across the square. The sky was clear sunlight reflecting off the bronze plaque that now bore her name. A group of high school students stood nearby, their teacher pointing at the plaque. "This is where the Brooks Protocol began," he said proudly, "where one woman taught a city the meaning of respect." Elena paused, smiling at the group. A young black girl turned toward her, eyes shining with admiration. "You're Judge Brooks, aren't you?" Elena nodded. "Yes, I am." The girl clutched her notebook nervously. "I want to study law like you." Elena bent down slightly, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then start by listening. The law is only a tool. Listening is where justice begins." The girl nodded eagerly, her smile radiant. Elena watched them walk away, her heart full of quiet emotion. The wind carried the sound of their laughter through the square. She lifted her gaze toward the open sky, clear and endless. A year ago, she had been dragged from the place she belonged. Today, she walked freely through it, surrounded by respect and belief. Life rarely restores balance quickly, but when it does, the reward is not victory, it is change. Elena took a deep breath and smiled. In the distance, the city hall clock struck 3, its chime echoing through the bright afternoon sky. She whispered to herself, "Justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be practiced every day." She turned toward the glass doors. Above the entrance, new words gleamed in the sunlight city hall, "Where justice begins." And for the first time after a year of storms, Elena felt at peace. There was no fear, no anger, only faith that once truth is brought to light, it will always find its way. A year later, spring returned to Chicago. The wind drifted gently through the old brick streets, carrying the scent of coffee from small cafes along the avenues. That morning, the square in front of City Hall was more crowded than usual. A large banner hung above the steps 1 year of the Brooks Protocol, a new era of justice. On the stage, set in the center of the square, Elena Brooks stepped forward to prolonged applause. She wasn't wearing a judge's robe, only a simple black dress and a light-colored coat. Her smile was calm, not proud, but filled with the quiet strength of someone who had come to understand the true cost of struggle. Exactly 1 year ago, she began her voice carrying across the open air. "I was dragged from this very place. I remember feeling ashamed, humiliated, and angry. But then I realized no one can take away your dignity unless you choose to surrender it." The crowd fell silent. Some, who had followed the trial the year before, were in tears. Elena continued, "Today, I am not here to relive the past. I am here to thank everyone who believed change was possible. The Brooks Protocol has now been adopted in over 20 states. Thousands of officers have undergone training focused on awareness and human dignity. But this journey is not over. It has only just begun." Applause erupted once more. Among the crowd stood Rachel Kim and Malik, side by side, smiling proudly. Behind them were young police officers in new uniforms, their badges engraved with the words, "Serve with dignity." Elena took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across the square. "To those who have been dismissed, humiliated, or excluded, I want you to know this truth always finds its voice. It may not be heard immediately, but it will rise when the time is right. I am living proof of that." The wind stirred, brushing the hem of her coat. Sunlight glinted off the bronze plaque engraved with her words, "Respect is the foundation of justice." Elena reached out her fingertips, resting lightly on the inscription. "I once thought justice was the final verdict in a courtroom. Now I understand justice is how we live each day when we choose to listen instead of judge, to understand instead of fear." At the back of the crowd, a man in a security uniform stood still. It was Marcus Blake. After serving his sentence, he now worked at a community center. His eyes met Elena's, filled with remorse. She looked at him for a brief moment and gave a small nod. There was no anger, only silent forgiveness from someone who had already moved beyond the pain. After the ceremony, Elena stepped down from the stage, walking across the very steps where she had once fallen. The tiles beneath her feet were new and gleaming, but in her mind she still remembered every rough edge of that old morning. A group of law students approached her. One young woman asked Judge Brooks what kept you from giving up when everyone seemed to stand against you. Elena smiled. "Because if I had stayed silent, they would have believed it was normal. And justice doesn't die because of injustice. It dies because people stop speaking." The girl nodded, eyes shining with tears. Elena placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. If one day you see something wrong, don't turn away. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "Enough," and the world begins to change. As evening fell, the square slowly emptied. Elena stood alone watching the last rays of sunlight bathe the courthouse facade in gold. She closed her eyes and took a long breath. The sound of the city clock echoed its chime, blending with the steady rhythm of her calm heartbeat. She knew her fight wasn't over. There would still be prejudice mistakes and people treated unfairly. But now she was no longer alone. A new generation stood behind her people who believed in dignity, in humanity, and in justice. Elena turned and walked into the radiant glow of the setting sun. Each step was a promise justice would never be silent again. The narration fades softly, like a whisper carried by the wind. The story you've just heard isn't only about a courtroom. It's about belief. If you believe that justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone, share this story. Leave your thoughts in the comments like this video, and follow us as we continue writing the next chapters where dignity triumphs over prejudice and truth always has the final word.